Good evening from Vancouver, University of British Columbia, Vancouver, BC. Before we start our talk by Dr. Elsie Lewison, I'd like to express a land acknowledgement. Although we are on a virtual meeting, we are on this unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and we acknowledge that we are guests on this territory and recognize all the past histories and the value that they have provided, and we are guests on their territory. This is the UBC Himalaya programs. Can we have the next slide? I just want to show the programs. Yeah, this just before I can introduce to our UBC Himalaya program, I would like to sort of introduce that this summer we have every summer we have this Tibetan and Nepali language course, and our course is now those who are interested in joining our course are able to register. Those who are in Canada, in Vancouver or BC, you will be able to register from. If you're access student, you have to register by 13th March. All others UB students can register anytime. But this will be extensive Nepali and Tibetan teaching. It's unique in Canada. There's no other such program. This year we will be meeting in person. Hopefully there will be no changes and all the COVID restrictions will be lifted. So this is one of the major program of the UBC Himalaya program and UBC Asian Studies department. Can I have the next slide? I'd like to introduce you to our UBC Himalaya program. I won't go through lists of all the individuals who are involved, but we are a group of in different fields working on the Nepal and the Himalayan regions and the Tibetan areas in the Himalaya. And we also include this postdoc, Dagmar Shrestha, who's a Kenzie postdoc, and Elsie, who's this Afghan speaker, is also a postdoc. And this year, we are very happy to announce for the first year in January, when our new faculty colleague, Pasang Yengki Sharpa, joined the UBC Department of Asian Studies and First Nations Endangered Language section. So this is the first semester that Pasang has been with us at UBC and with Himalaya program. Our work at UBC Himalaya has really made possible by Blenda Shriram, who is really absolutely capable and has organizing these talks and managing all of us. I'll ask my colleague, Professor Sherry Snyderman, to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tsering, for the introduction to the Himalaya program. I also just want to mention that for updates for all of the events and language courses that Tsering mentioned, you can sign up for the mailing list on the Himalaya program website. And I'd like now to introduce our colleague, Dr. Elsie Lewison, whom, as you just heard, is a member of the Himalaya Program Steering Committee. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at UBC, funded by SSHRC, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dr. Lewison completed her PhD in geography at the University of Toronto, where her dissertation research examined efforts to develop agricultural markets in Nepal's agrarian frontiers. And that's what we'll have an opportunity to hear about today. She has also served as project manager for Infrastructures of Democracy, which is a 7-year SSHRC Insight research project led by Professor Catherine Rankin, which I've also had the privilege of serving as co-investigator on. And it's in that context that I've come to work with and know Elsie as a wonderful colleague who's always able to push our thinking to the next level and get everybody together in a really collaborative and unique way. So it's really just a pleasure to have Elsie here at UBC now. She's currently teaching a graduate course, a seminar on development discourses and practices as well in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And it's really a pleasure to be able to hear about her research tonight. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Elsie to share her slides and share her work with us. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And thank you to the Himalaya program, and thank you to all of you for kind of fighting through Zoom fatigue to join us this evening. I'm gonna try sharing my slides. Does that look okay? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Great. So this evening I'm going to be talking a bit about some research that I have been doing around agricultural development interventions in the northern districts of Karnali province in Nepal, with a particular focus on Jumla district. And this is a region that you often find framed as a frontier in popular media and development discourses. And it's a frontier that's often associated with both ideas of value and opportunity, as well as vulnerability and threat. So on the one hand, new opportunities for expanding commercial agriculture are being celebrated as positive processes of modernization and development. And as you can see here, apple production has really been at the center of these narratives. And then on the other hand, we also have framings of the region that are centered on the threats that processes of modernization pose to vulnerable ecologies and cultural traditions. So in this presentation, what I want to do is kind of take a look at some of the different ways that these understandings of Jumla district as a site of both value and vulnerability have been taken up within different state and non-state policies and programs over the last decade or so. And I'll be building on fieldwork that I conducted in the region in 2014 and 2015, as well as some follow-up visits in Kathmandu and kind of desk research that I've been doing since then. So something that's really struck me as I've been kind of charting these different interventions and that I want to focus on today is how farmers and women in particular are being asked to perform as both these kind of competitive entrepreneurs and as caring stewards of environmental and human health. And I want to try to sort of highlight some of the tensions and contradictions in what's being asked of them. So what I'll do in the rest of the talk is to kind of first introduce you to Jumla and the Karnali region, and then I'll give you sort of a brief tour through some of the major programs and projects in the agriculture sector in the 2010s. And I'll try to kind of highlight some of these different articulations of kind of frontier logics of value and vulnerability as we kind of go along. And then I'll conclude by pointing out some potentially promising convergences around markets for traditional food crops and for organics. But I also want to suggest that achieving more environmentally and socially just food systems in the region will also require questions of political rights and accountability. So Jumla district, where I completed most of my fieldwork, is located here in northwestern Nepal. Today, Jumla is one of 10 districts in Karnali province, which was established in 2017. Before 2017, Jumla was the headquarters of the Karnali zone, which is made up of the 5 northernmost districts. So you can see those shaded there on the map. And often the term kind of Karnali region is associated with those 5 northern districts. So if we go way back to the 12th and 13th centuries, there was actually a very large, fairly prosperous kingdom in this region that was based in Jumla. But in more recent history, this area has really been marginalized and rendered peripheral relative to both political and economic power. So as a result, Karnali zone districts have been and remain some of the poorest and most difficult to access in the country, And just to give you an idea, the first motorable road connection to the region was only completed in 2007. Compared to national averages, people living in these districts tend to face significantly lower life expectancies and higher rates of undernutrition. As you can see, this is also an arid high hills region. Focusing on Jumla district here, only about 15% of the land is considered arable. And according to the latest data, less than 12% of cultivated land was irrigated. So between the terrain and the climate, agriculture is quite difficult, and it really requires expert knowledge and skills. Historically, major food grains in the region have included specialized cold-tolerant varieties of rice called Marsi rice, as well as finger millet, foxtail millet, proso millet, wheat, maize, barley, and buckwheat. And some of these, like proso millet, tend to be treated as more of a hardy emergency crop and planted when weather conditions aren't super great. Households have also planted a diverse variety of beans, potatoes, amaranth, and other vegetables, and also foraged foods in nearby forests. Concerted efforts to try to modernize agriculture in the region date all the way back, well, not that far, back to about the 1970s. And these interventions, which were led by state and foreign development agencies, tended to treat many traditional crops and foraged foods as backward and irrelevant. Instead, they were attempting to introduce packages of improved high-yielding varieties of wheat, rice, and maize, along with chemical inputs. They also flew in and distributed thousands of fruit and nut tree saplings, mostly apples. And these were meant to be commodity crops that could generate income for farmers that they could then use to buy inputs and other things. Overall, though, these efforts were very successful. This was in part due to the absence of motorable roads, which was a pretty major barrier to selling crops and purchasing inputs. Another factor, though, was that farmers had actually already achieved pretty remarkable levels of efficiency in their fields. And this is a quote from Peter Whiteman, who was an agronomist stationed in Jumla in the 1970s and 80s. And he documented the immense amount of expertise that went into existing farming practices. And this is just a quote taken from one of his reports where he concludes that dramatic improvements are neither obvious nor easy. So coming to the 2000s, though, Jumla and its neighbors have seen pretty rapid transformations over the last 2 decades. One major catalyst of change that I don't really have time to kind of get into was the 10-year civil conflict between Maoist forces and the Nepal army that ended in 2006. And the conflict led to many people fleeing the region, both temporarily and some more permanently. But then a second major catalyst of change that I'll focus on a bit more here has been the arrival of motorable roads. So the Circuit Jumla road was completed in 2007. And since then, there's been an explosion of road building in the district and the surrounding region. And even though many of these roads aren't in great shape, the connections have meant that imported food, and particularly cheap white rice that's coming up from India and southern Nepal, has become more readily available to buy in local markets for much of the year. And this availability in turn has meant that having a cash income to buy food has become an increasingly dependable way of making sure that your family has food throughout the year. And it has led many people to depend less on those traditional climate hardy emergency crops. Rice that you buy in the market and new packaged food like instant noodles have also been hugely time saving, particularly for women. And this factor has become more important as people in households are taking on more off-farm wage labor, and more families are sending their children to school, which has left women taking on an increasing share of household and agricultural labor. So finally, while many people are seeking cash incomes from off-farm work, there has also been a gradual shift to food crops that have higher value in local markets, particularly dried beans and potatoes. And then there's also been this dramatic expansion of apple production. And a large part of the appeal of apples is that they're generally seen as requiring relatively minimal labor, and are pretty well suited to these upland sloping fields, as you can see in this photo. I'll also point out, though, that apples are pretty climate sensitive and delicate, which makes them a potentially risky investment, particularly if you're putting a lot of money into them. So I want to turn now to look at some development interventions in the region. And then when I was in Jumla in 2014 and 2015, there were dozens and dozens of different agricultural programs at work. So I'm just going to focus on a few significant ones here. So first, a major local scale initiative that I want to start with, and that other programs had to kind of awkwardly work around, was a 2007 decision to declare Jumla fully organic. The decision was intended to capitalize on still pretty low levels of chemical use in order to promote local products and tourism. This decision was made by Jumla bureaucrats and politicians, and it officially banned all use of chemical inputs, although by most accounts, actual enforcement has been somewhat lenient. So at the same time, we also have a number of programs that are starting up that were focused more aggressively on commercializing agricultural production. And they kind of fall roughly into two different camps. So the first were projects funded by external development donors. And these include, I'm going to throw a bunch of large names at you, but these include the High Value Agriculture Project in hill and mountain areas funded by UN's International Fund for Agriculture Development. And it was located in these districts. We also have the Asian Development Bank's project called High Mountain Agribusiness and Livelihood Improvement Project, located in these districts. And then another example is UK Aid's Rural Access Program Phase 3, which was primarily focused on road building, but also included agricultural components as well. And that was located there. So on the whole, these projects aim to improve local livelihoods by incorporating households into national and ideally international agricultural markets or value chains. They encouraged farmers to transition away from subsistence production and to invest in high value commercial crops like apples or off-season vegetables. The programs have focused on linking farmers with agribusinesses and supporting commercialization with kind of small matching grants and lots of trainings. And these trainings covered concrete skills, but also were more generally intended to sort of teach farmers to become good entrepreneurs in terms of taking risks and responding to market forces. So these projects generally encourage the use of improved modern crop varieties and, at least outside of Jumla, a balanced use of chemical inputs. But I will point out that there was a 2-year pilot program for the High Value Agriculture Project that was experimenting with introducing organic certification for apples in Jumla. But then the staff running the pilot ended up deciding that certification wasn't actually cost effective at the time. So they brought that to an end just as the kind of main project was gearing up. So a second category of project focused on commercialization were regional commodity projects funded by national scale state agencies. One was the Apple Self-Reliance Program, announced in 2011, which focused on promoting apple production in 7 Northwest districts, shown there. And then in 2016, we have the rollout of the much larger scale Prime Minister Agriculture Modernization Program, which included a whole range of commodity crop programs and livestock programs. And in the Karnali, Jumla was declared an apple super zone, and it is one of 16 crop-specific super zones in the country, and those are shown there in that map. So both of those projects have been promoted as a response to Nepal's very high levels of dependence on imported food. Both have used significant subsidies to encourage farmers to invest in modern technology and to scale up production. In Jumla, the focus has been primarily on promoting new apple varieties and high-density planting systems. To my knowledge, neither the Apple Self-Reliance Program or the Prime Minister Program have explicitly promoted chemical inputs in Jumla, but at the same time, supporting organic production has definitely not been a focus for either of these. So to just give a little summary here, these value chain and regional commodity programs have really encouraged Jumla farmers to make a rapid shift away from diversified production systems and low value traditional crops, and to address and to adopt modern methods and entrepreneurial mindsets. Now, in contrast to these interventions, there were also a variety of projects and programs that have framed a shift away from traditional crops and diversified production, not as a solution, but instead as a problem. So these projects have been motivated in part by urgent concerns in international scientific communities about rapid declines in global genetic diversity in food and agriculture crops. And the concern here is that loss of diversity is going to make it increasingly difficult to adapt to new diseases and to climate change. And a lot of money has gone into off-site conservation in gene banks, but there's also been growing attention to the importance of maintaining diversity on farms and in dynamic ecosystems. And this has led to a push to conserve on-farm agrobiodiversity in places that haven't yet converted to industrial monocrops, so places like the Karnali. And as you can see, these concerns have also kind of partly intersected with an increased focus on nutrition in development programs, specifically around encouraging dietary diversity and discouraging people from eating so-called junk foods. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of programs here. So the most prominent intervention promoting agrobiodiversity in the 2010s was the Local Crop Project. This was funded by the Global Environment Facility and Bioversity International, it's a hard name to say, Bioversity International, and implemented by a Nepali NGO called Local Initiatives for Biodiversity Research and Development, or LEBIRD for short. And it was implemented in these districts. And LEBIRD has a much longer history of leading agrobiodiversity programs in Jumla and other parts of Nepal. And its projects have focused on establishing seed banks, as well as conducting participatory field trials to develop more useful farmers' varieties of traditional crops. A major component of these projects has also been promoting the production and consumption of traditional foods through media campaigns and things like food fairs. And you see a picture of a food fair there. And there's also been this big campaign to to brand crops like millets, buckwheats, and amaranth as Himalayan superfoods. And many of the projects implemented by Liebert, including the local crop project, have also encouraged the use of organic production methods as well. So another somewhat overlapping program was the Nutrition in Mountain Agroecosystems project, which was just kind of kicking off when I was there in 2015. And this project was funded by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, or SDC, and it was led by the International Organization for Organic Agricultural Movements, or IFOAM, and you might be familiar with IFOAM. And it was implemented in these districts. And its aim was to support both agrobiodiversity and organic agriculture, all under the overarching framework of nutrition. And activities included media campaigns and a variety of smaller scale initiatives, like supporting school and home gardens, providing training, and a kind of more recent focus on marketing traditional crops. And I'll also just note too that there were additional nutrition-oriented interventions that did not link nutrition to either agrobiodiversity or organic production. Probably the most significant example is the quite large-scale Nepal agriculture food security project. And this was supported by a big multi-donor trust fund and implemented by the World Bank in these districts. And this project was intended to increase productivity and diversify diets through the introduction of improved crop varieties and livestock breeds that were not local or traditional, along with modern chemical inputs. And then there were also a whole range of kind of smaller scale projects that incorporated a mix of supports for both improved and local crop varieties, often with a focus on nutrition and income generation. So to summarize briefly, again, alongside value chain and regional commodity programs that were pushing farmers to shift away from traditional crops and to embrace modern technology, we also have these programs pushing farmers to preserve and consume traditional crops and to avoid chemical inputs. And then there were other programs that were sort of combining elements of both of these approaches. So this is a quote from an interview with the director of a Jumla-based NGO that I did pretty early in my research. And he told me with pretty clear frustration, we are a development laboratory. They're doing research on development out here. And this line really stuck with me as I kind of came to better understand the institutional landscape of agricultural interventions in the region and what it meant for farmers trying to navigate them. Most of these programs that I've talked about were located not only in a limited number of districts, as you've seen from the maps I've shown, but also a limited number of local wards or villages in these districts. And farmers, particularly economically and politically marginalized farmers, tended to have little to no say in which of these various programs they would be invited to participate in. Interventions also tended to be pretty short-lived, usually 2 to 5 years. And these timelines alongside the kind of conflicting approaches and messaging made it pretty hard for farmers to anticipate what kinds of supports, if any, might be available kind of a year or two down the line. So when I was there, farmers in the region were also encountering some real economic and agroecological tensions and pressures. So apples, for example, were in direct competition with many of the Himalayan superfoods in the upland fields. Meanwhile, both increased density in apple planting and climate change were contributing to the spread of new diseases. And as farmers invested more in their orchards, they were also starting to face new competitive pressures to improve the appearance and consistency of their apples. And all of these were increasing the appeal of turning to pretty efficient and time-saving chemical pesticides and fertilizers. So meanwhile, with increased integration into markets, producing safe, healthy food didn't necessarily mean that households were eating this food. And this is a quote from a farmer I spoke with who pointed this out. He said, "We sell our products and buy rotten rice from the Terai," and the Terai refers to the southern region of Nepal. That's what we eat. We sell our good products to the Terai and bring up their rice, which is kept for how long, we don't know. So just for example, when I was there, there'd already been some growing demand for the local Marsi rice in urban areas. So more farmers were selling Marsi rice to then buy cheaper white rice. Producing Marsi rice also required a lot of labor time for weeding. And with more people involved in off-farm work, I was told that many households were starting to kind of illicitly turn to chemical herbicides to take care of the weeds. And then on a similar point, traditional Himalayan superfoods also tended to require a lot of time to process and prepare. And this was posing a big challenge for women who were having to take on more household and agricultural labor responsibilities. So kind of leading up to a conclusion here, I do also want to point to some areas of kind of tentative convergence in recent years. Among the large-scale donor-funded projects, there's been some shifts to try to align economic growth, nutrition, and conservation agendas. So just for one example, IFAD's new large-scale agriculture sector development program, which is kind of a successor to the high-value agriculture program. The new one has included highly nutritious crops, including buckwheat, minor millets, and beans, as potential value chains under its mandate. And then on the other hand, both the local crop project and the nutrition in mountain agroecosystems project have started to sort of shift further towards a focus on developing markets for traditional crops and organic products. So these shifts may begin to help reconcile tensions between calls for Jumla farmers to perform as these competitive entrepreneurs and as stewards of human and ecological health. At the same time, though, market-based approaches alone unlikely to kind of fully resolve these tensions. And there's a lot to be said about this. I mean, there's been a lot written about this, but just to highlight a couple issues, competitive market forces tend to push producers towards specialization and homogenization, which runs up against diversity agendas. And another concern, as we've seen, is that high-end niche markets for organic and specialty foods are obviously more profitable for farmers, but rising prices can also make those foods less accessible within rural communities. So as I mentioned before, some of these dynamics are actually already beginning to be visible in Jumla. So another recent dynamic that I also want to highlight, though, has been political advocacy for farmers' rights in policymaking processes. So in recent years, these rights have often been framed in terms of food sovereignty. And the national government actually passed a Right to Food and Food Sovereignty Act in 2018. It is important to point out that the meaning and policy agendas associated with food sovereignty have been pretty ambiguous and contested in Nepal. But there have been a number of kind of concrete struggles related to farmers' rights that have been led by civil society alliances, farmers' unions, and NGOs like Liebird. These have included campaigns to restrict Monsanto's presence in Nepal, to resist US pressures to adopt more restrictive intellectual property rights that govern farmers' ability to save and exchange seeds, campaigns to demand greater public consultations in the national agricultural planning processes, and recently around issues of foreign investment and ownership in the agricultural sector. So since 2017, we also have the establishment of provinces as regional policy-making bodies that are, in theory, democratically accountable. And these could provide an arena for greater farmer voice in agricultural policy-making processes. So along these lines, the policy agenda for the first elected Karnali provincial government is pretty interesting. It emphasized agricultural commercialization, but also promised ambitious, large-scale, long-term public investments in strategies that at least somewhat aim to embed processes of market expansion in social and environmental agendas. So for example, the Provincial Organic Agriculture Act and the Right to Food and Food Sovereignty Act included commitments to public investments in research and development infrastructure for locally appropriate organic technologies, local as well as national market infrastructure, and some tentative steps towards redistributive land reforms, although not a whole lot there. In addition, in face of pretty significant skepticism from large development agencies, policymakers in the province also declared their intention to follow Jumla's lead and gradually transition the province as a whole to organic production. So it definitely has to be seen how and to what extent these policies are actually implemented. There's been a lot of political turmoil in the provincial government over the last few years, and new elections are scheduled for just a few months from now, I believe. But I do think that these provincial commitments, and maybe more importantly, arenas, have the potential to offer a basis for more socially and environmentally just approaches to agricultural development. Importantly, though, any real movement on provincial agendas is really going to require at least some degree of cooperation from not only national policymakers, but from all of these powerful international development agencies that, as we have seen, are playing a very active role in the agricultural sector in Nepal. So to conclude, we're leaving lots of time for questions. So to conclude, I want to come back briefly to this idea of Jumla and the Karnali as a frontier. Anna Singh has argued that imaginaries of both kind of untapped economic value and environmental vulnerability, both of which are kind of associated with this idea of frontiers, that these can be used to rationalize and justify external interventions to control resources and people. Now, Anna Singh was writing about violent enclosures and processes of dispossession, and clearly the kinds of interventions that we find in Jumla and the Karnali are by and large intended to be enabling and to improve lives. But as the NGO director who we met earlier pointed out, existing structures of accountability can also leave people feeling powerless and like they're living in a kind of development laboratory. And this question of accountability really gets to the core of the concept of food sovereignty. And this is a quote from Raj Patel, who I think puts it really well. He says, if we talk about food sovereignty, we talk about rights. And if we do that, we must talk about ways to ensure those rights are met across a range of geographies by everyone in substantive and meaningful ways. And I think that this is a good quote to sort of end on, because as many people in the food sovereignty movement have argued, I think that this principle really needs to remain at the forefront of food system planning and practice, particularly in marginalized agrarian regions like the Karnali. Yeah, so I'm actually going to wrap it up there, and I am happy to hear from you all and to take any questions that you might have.
Yes, we are now transitioning to the discussion and the question and answer session. So I invite everyone to drop any questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom meeting. And I will go ahead with the first question by Brian. So Brian was wondering about the marketing of Nepali foods. So are the markets both domestic and also export markets? And have there been any efforts or moves to kind of embrace marketing branding, such as, for example, high mountain Nepali apples or something in that direction? So yeah, it would be great if you could say a little bit about that. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so there's been, so the value chain projects that I mentioned, ideally they wanted to sort of try to reach into these international markets. There's been a lot of challenges in moving Nepali commodities to international markets, in part because of the infrastructures around like phytosanitary controls. And around the quantity of production. And I talked to a number of people who had spoken to people in other countries who were interested in trying to import kind of specialty Nepali goods like organic apples. But the problem is that Jumla producers are still not producing a ton of apples, and they are still not producing apples that are very kind of consistent in quality standards that these sort of big international markets are used to. So there's been a lot of just kind of technical challenges in trying to reach into these international markets. And yeah, so most of the kind of products that I've been talking about have been within national internal markets in Nepal. But there have, I mean, I've just sort of recently been reading about some, I guess, successes. We'll have to see. The Marcy rice was being marketed in Canada. I think they managed to make a link there. And there's also been some like smaller scale links in Thailand and Malaysia, I believe. And then to the second point about trying to brand products with different kinds of labels. So there was the initial effort to try to certify them. And as I mentioned, that kind of ran into problems in part because there's a lot of trust in the idea of apple or products from Jumla and similar regions being organic, because they're kind of associated with these like backward regions that haven't been modernized. That's beginning to change now, but at least when I was doing my research, trying to certify apples and mark them up with a premium was running into problems because other people would market apples as organic from Jumla, and consumers basically trusted that they were. There have also other interventions that I didn't get to. There have been sort of smaller scale efforts to brand Jumla beans with the high, I'm getting all my acronyms mixed up, but there's another initiative run through, I want to say an FAO related organization that's around mountain products specifically, and there's different mountain products from different parts of the world, and they have a specialty mountain brand that they have linked up with a few, and again, this is like, I think they're linked up with like maybe 100 households, less than that even, and they're trying to market those beans internationally with the special label. So there are definitely initiatives, and a lot of them are pretty small scale. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a lot of movement on the kind of certification front, organic certification front. Again, in part because production has remained pretty small scale and not super professionalized. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question from Logan Emlet regarding migration and mobility and so forth, or a couple of different questions related to the topic. So maybe you can take some of them and answer
Sure.
to some of those aspects. What to you? So I'm reading the question. So to what extent has the extensification of agriculture vis-a-vis increased apple cultivation and reclamation of Paku land, sorry for the pronunciation, as well as associated shifts in gendered labor practices impacted north-south, transhumance, and seasonal migration? And what are related trends in local livestock practices, for example? And to what extent do you think that these land use changes have altered the movement of animals and people from areas further north? So how do you think agricultural transformation in Jumla has implicated migration of those folks in Jumla and other places? So yeah, would be great if you could answer to some of those aspects. Thanks.
Okay, I might need you to repeat a few back to me, but I'll try to start. I mean, I think I'm not a super expert in these things, but my understanding is that a lot of the north-south trade patterns had already really begun to kind of die down before apple production really started to take off. And I mean, and that had to do with, I mean, going way back. So for those of you not familiar, a major part of livelihoods in this region, kind of going back centuries, was movement from kind of the Tibetan regions to get salt, bringing grains up to the Tibetan regions to get salt and other goods, and then bringing these along with handicrafts made in kind of Jumla area, and butter and horses, bringing these down to the kind of southern regions and even into India to sell and kind of move back. And those kind of older trade routes, yeah, were really in decline by, my understanding is like the 1980s or 1990s, having to do with closures of the border, and the creation of parkland, at least in the Jumla area, limited the amount of land that was available for animal grazing, so that impacted livestock numbers. And then at least according to Jagannath Adhikari, the institution of community forests actually also really impacted these trade patterns because people weren't able to kind of bring their animals into these forest areas. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I mean, there's been kind of competing migration trends as far as I can understand. During the conflict, there was a lot of migration out of the district, as I mentioned. And I read some data that says that people are tending to migrate out of the district for temporary labor migration for longer periods than they used to. And this was another kind of pattern of migration that happened alongside and kind of more recently than the longer transboundary migrations. But a lot of people were leaving areas like Jumla to go find temporary work in the winter seasons, partly to get money, and then partly also because it was really cold and there wasn't enough food at home, so you like sent people out to go eat other places and make their own money, so they weren't eating up your food stocks. so I think, I mean, and that is certainly still going on, particularly for families without a lot of land, and Dalit families. That's still a huge part of their livelihoods today. But it's really hard to know exactly how apples are playing into this. I think I really need to, I mean, if I was going to answer, I need to go back and get better statistics. Hopefully with the census coming out. I'm not sure if the agricultural census is coming with it, but hopefully we'll have some kind of better data on livelihood and incomes. But I mean, I think some people are able to make enough money from apples that they're not having to migrate, and then other people are losing money from trying to invest in apples and end up losing their land. So yeah, that's kind of a rambling answer, but yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating question, and I think the dynamics are really still playing out as the apple industry kind of continues to grow.
Yeah, thank you for answering some of the aspects of this very complex question. I learned a lot because I know from my research about, of course, kind of the trade with Tibet, but I have never thought about the implications so much in detail and how that also then connects with your topic, for example. Yeah, I know that, it will be very nice to take a question from our steering committee. So I saw that, Sarah, you had a couple of aspects you would like to address. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you like.
Thanks so much, Elsie. That was really wonderful to hear, and all of the details. And for me, one of the most interesting dimensions is the sort of relationship or constant negotiation between farmers on the ground and these various levels of, I guess we could call them governance and or the kind of organizational sector. So you've got the farmers, you've got local policymakers, as you put it, and then you have the international development agendas, and how all of these things come into articulation, I think is really interesting to me and what they result in. So my question really was about this kind of branding around Himalayan superfoods and how you found farmers themselves took to that, if at all, and I mean, how is that talked about in Nepali? And you had a lot of quotes about people talking about how they understood themselves to be in a development laboratory and selling their food elsewhere, but is there also a sort of local discourse around the value of traditional foods and the kind of nutrition that they bring? And have you seen that shift over time? How is that? What's the texture of that? And then I guess, does that have any effect also on policy, Nepali policymakers and or international development policy, or are these things operating in a way, quite separate spheres?
Thanks, Sarah. That's a hard question. I mean, I guess in my conversations with people, I mean, and I think, so, I mean, just for some background, I mean, my Nepali was better back then. I mean, I was able to sort of ask questions and get answers with in the vocabulary that I understood. And I was also working with research assistants who were very amazing and helped kind of translate some of those deeper questions of cultural understandings of food traditions. I mean, I guess from what I understood, it's really hard to sort of separate out kind of development discourses and kind of what people really felt. I mean, at least in the way people spoke to me, and really this might have had a lot to do with my positionality too, of people kind of viewing me, associating me with some kind of NGO or some kind of development organization that was probably trying to get them to perform a certain identity in order to, write a report about it or something. So at least what I heard, it was pretty mixed. And I mean, I think at least in 2014 and 2015, a pretty dominant current in sort of just kind of casual, informal conversations was around this sort of reclamation of local foods. And and again, I mean, I have to acknowledge the filters happening here, but I mean, at least from what I could understand, there, I mean, it was like there was a lot of pride in kind of reclaiming these foods. I remember an instance of going with somebody who was working on dietary diversity issues and going to a hotel, like a very small hotel in a kind of very out of the way part of Jumla, and the hotel, and she was like asking about sisnu and dedo, which are like kind of traditional, like quite traditional Jumla foods, and he was like really excited to serve us dedo and sisnu, and she ended up really not liking it, like couldn't finish it, which was kind of a awkward scene, but yeah, I mean, I think like, I mean, a lot of it was bound up in sort of politics of like reclaiming Karnali and Jumla identity as like something to be proud of and not something to be ashamed of. And often it would be tied up with like stories of, I mean, I wanted to include the history of Jumla as having this like big prosperous kingdom, because I mean, that came up a lot in conversations with people in everyday language. And the experience of being conquered by the Shah kings and incorporated in this marginalized position within Nepal. That was very present on a lot of people's minds. I'm sure that there's like complex like caste and ethnicity dynamics to that narrative too, that again, I was probably not picking up on everything there, but yeah, so I would say that the kind of reclamation of traditional foods, yeah, was something that was kind of struck a deeper chord with people, and kind of was caught up with sort of politicized ideas as well.
So it's not just that was introduced as a kind of external idea and, you know, needs to be completely critiqued. It's more like, you know, that sentiment is there, but it has been maybe pushed or pulled in different directions by the kind of external actors. Is that?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, thanks for bringing that up, because I realize in the way that I presented it, it does kind of seem like it's just this external idea that gets imposed. But I mean, as I also pointed out, there's really real economic pressures that are pushing people away from those crops. And I stayed in the Liebert office when I was in Jumla, and I remember, I mean, the Liebert staff were just amazing. They did really excellent work, and were super, super dedicated. But I remember talking to like one of the senior people there, and she was just like, I feel like my work is it's like really disheartening because we're doing all this work around traditional crops, and people just can't plant them anymore, don't want to plant them anymore, because of these kind of larger economic pressures. So that's one of the reasons why I think that these new initiatives around kind of building markets for these crops, I mean, are really promising. I think that they could really, especially if they manage to sort of focus on sort of more local and national markets, I think that they could help to kind of reconcile some of those tensions. But again, I mean, I think you can't just stick with the market solutions. I think there needs to be kind of bigger structural changes to support that as well. And I guess in terms of, I mean, I just have to go back and talk to people again to understand sort of the shifts over time, and then also the degree to which that's influencing development initiatives. Although I will say that I know that part of the push within value chain, within the kind of big donor-funded value chain programs towards including local crops, I mean, local bureaucrats and agricultural development people, I mean, they have certainly been part of that push to include those crops in those programs. and a lot of them live in Jumla and are from Jumla, so I'm sure that that kind of is sort of reflected in their approaches.
Yeah, maybe I can. Oh, sorry. Maybe I can also add my question because it connects a little bit to us, if I may, shortly. I'm also interested how those programs actually kind of consider the longer term changes and structural changes that are necessary and important, considering climate change. So, I mean, that ties together within actually also those local foods who kind of are more diverse, and these aspects you had been mentioning already. And do you see that identity, as mentioned, is kind of like a important factor there? I mean, this centeredness on the groups of peoples, the diverse people living there, and their identity of kind of helping with that, because I see that strongly used to get policies through in Bhutan on that level and to commit to this kind of biodiversity and so forth. So are you hopeful for that? I mean, kind of just like a tendency, maybe. Thank you.
Thanks, Dagmar. Well, I guess I'll try to answer that. I mean, I think, so, I mean, in terms of kind of looking to long-term change and sort of the role that preserving agrobiodiversity in kind of coping with climate change, and that's a huge part of Liebert's programming and some of the agrobiodiversity supports that are coming into the district. I would say that their approach is pretty technocratic and like based in scientific scientific approaches. And I mean, another kind of interesting tension that I was noticing was that programs like Liebert, because they're sort of focused by these scientific agendas interested in genetic diversity, tended to focus on crops like buckwheat and like preserving different varieties of buckwheat in order, because these are like genetic kind of strains or resources that aren't well preserved in other parts of the world. But then like in Jumla, around the kind of identity, linking identity and local crops, it was things like local Marsi rice and diverse beans that tended to be the crops that people really wanted to promote. And especially, right, I mean, rice in particular is like really deeply embedded in high caste identities in the district. But anyways, yeah, so there was kind of this tension between like the scientific agenda's approach to agrobiodiversity and then the kind of more like identity politicized approach to agrobiodiversity. But then I mean, it's interesting that you bring up like climate change, because then you also have all these programs around climate change that are again like promoting improved high yielding introduced crop varieties and income or like commodity crop production as a strategy of climate resilience. And actually Liebert has started to implement climate smart programs funded by, I can't remember the acronym, but by a big climate program associated with the, I don't know, all the names are changing, but anyways, so they're starting to implement climate smart programs that actually are like completely at odds with their traditional focus on agrobiodiversity. And it's kind of interesting to see. And I've noticed that, I mean, activists associated with La Via Campesina are really like calling them out for this kind of move to climate smart approaches that incorporate chemicals and incorporate introduced varieties. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting dynamics around that, and the whole climate change thing. I mean, it's again like all of these different approaches to what it means to be climate resilient and what it means to adapt And farmers end up being at the kind of in the middle of all these different conflicting ideas of how to do that.
Thanks. Yeah, I have kind of one question which probably relates a little bit to that on tendencies. You have already said it's so difficult because there are so many different programs, and it's difficult to say where the path leads and so forth. Sampada asked first comments, thanks for this wonderful presentation. And then is wondering whether the ascendancy of agrobiodiversity programs has crowded out other forms of NGO-led development programs in Jumla. Is there kind of a tendency, or can one not really say that? Not really see that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, well, I'll first say that as a researcher, I mean, I had kind of blinkered vision focusing on like agriculture projects. And in the agriculture projects, I mean, you had NGOs, again, as I mentioned, the kind of smaller scale NGOs were focusing on a whole range of different issues. And I'm sure anyone familiar with Nepal knows how NGOs can sort of take up different initiatives without a whole lot of like ideological consistency. So yeah, I mean, I guess agrobiodiversity was often integrated into kind of other programs that included, like a range of different livelihood initiatives. And then, I mean, as far as I could tell, there was a rich and thriving landscape of NGOs doing all kinds of other sorts of activities. But yeah, I guess that's probably not a very satisfying answer, but I don't think that like agrobiodiversity specifically was kind of crowding out other issues. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, and I have an anonymous question that's also a little bit specific in detail. So is there any value adding industry activity in Jumla or Kathmandu using Jumla food commodities to process into food products or for domestic or export markets? Sorry, I read a little bit. I interrupted myself. Sorry, I hope it was understandable.
Yeah. So for value adding, I mean, there's different approaches to value adding that like kind of donor-led value chain development interventions have included. Again, I would say that most of these, at least until pretty recently, have not been oriented to export markets, just because, again, the production has been too small and not kind of professionalized enough. But around value adding, I mean, the value adding approaches that the kind of early value chain interventions were bringing were very basic. So they were things like sorting the apples into the like same varieties and grading them according to the kind of size and aesthetics. So that just speaks to kind of like the way that people were approaching apple production was not this like very highly professionalized, competitive, market oriented. I mean, it was market oriented, but not within these kind of like competitive markets. So the first kind of step of value chain interventions was really just like very basic value addition things like sorting your apples and packing them into boxes. Because apple production was incorporated into these other diverse livelihoods, and it wasn't a source of like major cash investment, at least when I was there, and that's changing. But in terms of other forms of value addition, I mean, there's been, like dating back to the 1970s, there's been initiatives to try to get farmers to process their apples into dried apple slices and to make jams and jellies. And this has been like something that every development intervention in the agriculture sector in Jumla has done for like decades to try to get people to do these processing activities. And I mean, one, they take a lot of labor, and as I said, a big appeal of apples was that they were labor saving. So I mean, that was kind of one reason that those didn't take off, maybe until recently. And then also you had to buy inputs for them. So you had to buy sugar for the jams and jellies, and you had to buy kind of special chemicals to process the apples as apple slices. So that was also a disincentive. Also, from what I understand, there's just not a lot of demand for those products in Nepal. I think mostly, I mean, I certainly bought my fair share of apple slices. I probably bought up like 1/10 of the district's production while I was there. I really liked them, but I mean, I think mostly they were being produced for tourists and kind of foreigners coming into the country in the region. Yeah, so I'm most familiar with apples, and I think, oh, and then the other kind of big value addition thing is alcohol production, and there's a kind of an interesting story around alcohol production, because the high value agriculture project was really looking for like processing firms and wholesalers to link farmers to. And they were running into a lot of issues trying to get kind of agribusinesses and wholesalers to kind of buy into their program and to sign contracts with local farmers. So they ended up turning to this distillery in the district, and it was like the only distillery that had been there for a really long time. But they had policies around not supporting alcohol production. So he had to so it was rebranded as apple juice or cider. But I'm pretty sure he was still buying apples for alcohol production. But then somebody I knew there was also just starting a new kind of fancy distillery in the district to produce apple brandy. And I know he was trying to kind of market that to high-end markets in Kathmandu. And I should check in with him about how that's doing. So I think alcohol has probably been the most successful value addition activity.
That's interesting to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, next I would like to take a question from my colleague Pasang, please. Yeah, please unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi, Elsie. Thank you so much for this presentation. I have my daughter here with me, so I'll keep my camera, turn my camera off after this question. But I'm really curious to hear if you could tell us about how the quote from the NGO representative describing Jumla as a laboratory for development, which is something I've also felt over the years. So how did that quote influence your research design and maybe shape your understanding of what you saw during your fieldwork? If you could just share with us some of your experiences, I think that would be really insightful.
Thanks, Passing. I mean, I'm not sure if I had a super systematic, well, I mean, I think part of the way that sort of insights like that early on in the research influenced the way I approached it was to really kind of was to have this kind of higher level view of the different interventions and organizations working in the district. I kind of went in sort of very specifically interested in apple production, and particularly the high value agriculture project, which I in the research, but I mean, I think, yeah, the idea that there were all of these different competing organizations was something that was really called out to, or like revealed to me through conversations with NGO, with people involved in NGOs and with people in the government, because it was a topic that came up over and over in conversation, was trying to sort of manage these different competing agendas and manage all the different competing requirements for paperwork. Yeah, and just like the different values associated with these projects. And I'll also say, I mean, that quote came kind of shortly after a story that he told me about how frustrated he was because the project, a project that they were working with, they had just spent like thousands and thousands of US dollars to hire a private plane to fly 10 experts and people from Kathmandu, I think, to Jumla and out of Jumla for just a 2-hour meeting. And he was kind of fuming about what a waste of resources this was. And that quote also came shortly after a comment about how, I mean, they say that all of this development money is flowing into Jumla, but actually so much of it is actually flowing back into the salaries and into the offices of the people implementing it. And anyone familiar with development knows that that is a very common sentiment. Yeah, I mean, I would say that kind of conversations with people in these organizations influenced a lot of how I was sort of approaching the questions that I was asking, and they changed quite a bit over the course of the research.
Is it possible to ask a second question? Otherwise, I can wait, Dagmar. Yeah, I actually had another question written first, but I think this is good to add here. So to me, it seems like, empowering Jumla residents to self-determine what to do with their agricultural practice would be much more efficient than empowering the development policy industry. So in your, based on your fieldwork, or maybe during your fieldwork or even after your fieldwork, did you notice any alternatives, alternative to what you were showing in your presentation that seemed hopeful or optimistic in another way?
Yeah, yeah, I did. and I think that, I mean, it's actually been kind of like a weird feeling where, I mean, a lot of people I know go into the research and it's just like critique, and I actually get to feel kind of hopeful looking at the research that, or at least the field that I've been working in. And I mean, I guess, again, I have to acknowledge the kind of filters that might be shaping how I view the situation and kind of the people who I was speaking to, and yeah, just be humble in some of these claims. But I mean, when I was there was a lot of there were collaborations happening with civil society, or alliances and organizations in Kathmandu and kind of Jumla level agriculture officers and people in the kind of local state, but then also between people in the local state and different NGOs and in the local research station, and they were all kind of collaborating on agendas that they sort of set for themselves. And just a very small example is one of the local agriculture officers noted, I mean, clearly irrigation and access to water was this huge deal for people in the district. And I mean, it's becoming an even bigger deal as changes kind of drying up existing water sources. So he had this big initiative to support snow collection ponds as this like very low tech system for helping farmers to irrigate their fields. And I'm not sure if it's going to be impacted by climate change, but anyways, it seemed pretty effective at the time. And they like within the district organized resources to do research on it and lobbied development organizations to provide funding for it. And this was kind of replicated in different ways. There was also like a research project, a locally initiated research project on different organic kind of management practices. And again, they were sort of like lobbying development organizations to pay for this out of like climate change funds and things. And then they were also getting support from these kind of more politicized Kathmandu-based organizations. And one of the kind of big activities that had just happened when I was there was the development of a 10-year district agricultural plan that they developed through community-based consultations. And I mentioned this in a lot of presentations, but one of the big finding was that farmers were actually making a lot more money off of beans than they were off of apples, and that the government should actually be putting a lot more resources into helping people produce beans and like organic approaches to bean production. And then the actors in Kathmandu kind of used this local agricultural plan that they had developed to try to lobby the national government to include more of these sort of local level planning processes. And this was during the drafting of the agricultural development plan, agricultural development strategy in 2015. So they were trying to sort of push back against the donor monopoly of these national planning processes by using this like local plan as an example of like how it should be done. So I don't know. Yeah, there were a lot of really kind of interesting activities happening at the local level that and these like networks of people that I found pretty hopeful. Yeah.
Yes, maybe we have time for one quick question at the end. We are running out of time slowly. So there's a question by Maya, also like observing neighboring regions like Dolpo. So there's often a very great amount of physical labor involved in processing traditional grains, and are those initiatives and so forth on the ground also focusing on bringing, for example, technical innovations as part of preserving agrobiodiversity and promoting food sovereignty, and therefore helping the people in a way to really, focus on this aspect as well. Would be great if you could say something to that.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. I don't have a ton to say about this, but I know Liebert has been focusing on like processing technologies, pretty small scale processing technologies. I don't know what the kind of take up of them has been. Oh, and the local crop project that I mentioned, I know that they've also been kind of focusing on that. And I think that the seed banks that they've started can be sort of a hub for kind of like sharing those technologies that people can access. So there's some work being done on it. I'm not sure like how good the take up has been.
Thanks. Yes, lots of fascinating questions, and lots for you to talk and answer. So we have to come to an end now, unfortunately. And I would like to turn over to Sarah for the closing of this session.
Thank you so much, Elsie. I mean, this has been a really expansive conversation. You've shared so much about your research experience, the results of that, and I hope we'll get to see where you're going next, and that perhaps some of the questions here play into your future research around policymaking and organic food production in the region, and we're looking forward to seeing that. Before we conclude, I also wanted to mention that the next Himalaya program event will be on March 7th, and that is going to be the first, the inaugural Himalaya program annual lecture, which is a new series that we're initiating this year with guest speakers from beyond UBC, and that will be from Carmelete Somo from University of California at San Diego, and the title is Gender in Himalayan Buddhism, Glacial Shifts in Attitudes and Institutions. So that will be an online event on March 7th at 6 p.m. And if you're interested, please register online through the Himalaya program website. Yes, and Belinda has just put it in the chat. Thank you. So I'd like to thank Elsie for the talk, and also my colleagues in the Himalaya Program Steering Committee, as well as Belinda Suin, our Student Work Learn program assistant, who has pulled off all of the technical magic behind this. And I'd also like to thank all of the participants who've been in the audience this evening for listening and for your wonderful questions. Thanks very much, and please do join us next time.